Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction. So I'll just jump right in. How many of you have done this before? You're in PowerPoint and you want to change the color of an object, but instead of using the correct commands, which are over here, you wind up clicking on one of the text style commands that's over here. Can anybody relate to this? Okay, awesome. I certainly can relate to this. So here's another one. In Word, have you ever clicked the next or previous changes commands over here when you really wanted the next or previous comments over here? Okay, I've definitely done this as well. Maybe I'm the only one. Or maybe you've tried using the paragraph borders command to insert a table into a document, because if you look around on the home ribbon, it's really the only thing in sight that looks like a table. So to just kind of shamelessly reference the title of this paper, in all of the cases that I've just described, you've executed a command that was not the command that you were looking for. And these are all examples of what we call in this paper, false feed-forward errors. And these are instances where cues in the interface suggest that an action is going to yield a particular result when in fact it actually will not. And stepping back just for a second, the motivation for this project came out of previous work where I spent a lot of time watching new users of GIMP trying to perform tasks. And a common strategy they observed is that participants would comb through the interface, reading command names and tooltips, and trying to find a command that would allow them to make some progress. And sometimes this worked really well. They'd find a command and it would help them continue. But other times they'd commit one of these false feed-forward errors. They'd find a command that looked to them like it was right, but a different command was what they actually needed. So just one more example. As part of one of the tasks, participants needed to flip one layer of a document. And the correct command to do this is the layer transform flip vertically command, and that flips the currently selected layer. But a lot of participants found the image transform flip vertically command instead. And this command flips all of the layers of the document, not just the currently selected layer. And when they'd make this mistake, they would oftentimes undo the command, click the layer again, and then repeat the error, because they were really, really convinced that they had found what they were looking for. So consider this point where the user is just about to make one of these errors. What if there was something in the interface that would help them detect that they were about to make an error, or to help them at least recover after they had made the error? And so we call these command disambiguation techniques, and the focus of the paper is on designing these interaction mechanisms. So I'll show you a number of prototypes that we developed to explore this idea at 3 points of time while the user is searching for and evaluating commands, while they're executing an incorrect command that they found, and after they've executed an incorrect command. And for 3 different types of commands that you commonly see in feature-rich applications. Commands that don't take any parameters, commands where you enter parameters in a dialog, and commands that require direct manipulation. And so in all, we developed high-fidelity prototypes of 5 main techniques within this design space, and I'll show those to you now. So the first technique we call detour submenus. So for commands in menus that could be confused with another command, we had a small branching icon next to the command's name, and then hovering over the item displays information on the command itself and several alternatives under an "Are you looking for" heading. And if one of the alternatives looks useful, the user can directly click it to invoke it. So the idea here is to show the user that there are commands that could be confused with a given command and enable them to explore these alternatives. We also include visual previews next to each of the commands to make it easier to evaluate the alternatives. And so this takes inspiration from prior work on advanced previewing techniques, such as Terry et al.'s side views. But whereas there the goal is to facilitate exploration of a parameter space for a given command rather, here it calls out differences between different commands. So the next technique, detour tooltips, is similar to detour submenus, but for commands that are in toolboxes or on ribbons. And so the basic idea is if you hover over a command, it displays something very similar to the detour submenu, but clear of the toolbox, and then you can still interact with the other options. So the first two techniques I've shown you are for when a user is searching for commands. The next two I'll show are designed to help the user that's already started using an incorrect command. The first one I call dialog linkups. So if the user opens a dialog for a command that has alternatives, they're displayed alongside the dialog. And as the user modifies parameters, the set of previews that are displayed alongside of it are updated for the command and its alternatives. And clicking alternatives switches the dialogues in place, migrating settings that have already been entered. We also wanted to explore this idea for direct manipulation tools, and that led to tool hot swaps. So the idea here is that while working, the user can perform direct manipulation operations, but also try out different commands with the click source strokes that they've already made transferred to the new command. And so finally, to help recovery after an incorrect command has been executed, we developed did you mean history and a feature that we call or do. So here the standard undo history dialog is augmented with a did you mean section that shows alternatives to the last command that was executed. And then these can be substituted for the last command with just one click. Or they can be cycled through by hitting a keyboard shortcut. And we call this or do as kind of equivalent to undo and redo. So I've demonstrated 5 techniques that we designed. And you could implement these techniques individually, but one of the nice things about this approach is that the techniques naturally work together. So you can imagine a user noticing that there are alternatives for a command in the menu before they click it, but kind of ignoring them at the time, knowing that if they get a result that they didn't expect, they could then cycle through the alternatives with this or do feature. So really, the commands have this potential to work together. And stepping back, just at a high level, all of these commands kind of act as a secondary organization on top of the application's existing structure. So the primary interface, menus, and toolbars, those can remain stable and predictable, while the secondary organization focuses on helping users to avoid frustration or errors while they're using the software. And the main focus of this work was on interaction design of these command disambiguation techniques. So we implemented the prototypes using HTML and JavaScript in a mock-up of the GIMP interface. And though this was a mock-up, it was very convincing. All of the videos I've shown you so far were in the mock-up, and our prototypes allowed people to try out the techniques to really experience what they're like to use. And the commands that we augmented in the mockups were identified using a text-based analysis of command names and tooltip text for GIMP, and along with a manual inspection of the interface. But in the paper, we discuss a number of alternative approaches that could be taken to automatically identify these commands that could be confused for one another. So we felt that our designs were promising, but we wanted to understand how users would react to the overall concept and to the particular techniques. So we recruited 12 participants and had each of them perform 3 scenarios using our prototypes. And in each scenario, we described the goal at a high level, then walked them through interacting with the prototype. And as they encountered the techniques, we would stop them and ask questions about their perceived advantages and disadvantages. So what did we learn? So first, at a high level, participants understood the techniques, and there was a wide agreement that the techniques would be beneficial, particularly for new users. So one person said, thinking back to when I did learn to use Excel for the first time in a serious way, having that kind of functionality would have saved me a lot of time and hassle. Participants also cited several features in particular as important. So first, the visual previews were often singled out as an important feature. One participant said, I think without the preview images, I would still click flip vertically. I would ignore it. I'd be like, whatever, it's just giving me more text, right? So the fact that you have previews there, I think, is extremely helpful. And another feature that was cited by several participants was this migrating of input between commands. So one participant said, I like this a lot. I can click here, I can say, oh yes, that's perfect, I'll stick with that. Or alternatively, no, what I was doing before was what I wanted to be doing. It's great that I don't have to go back and restart the task. And so this is kind of cool because it suggests that more than just helping the user to avoid errors and frustration, it lets them explore different commands. And we also got some insights into the challenges that face novice users with this type of error. So, for example, one user expressed that he didn't have an understanding of domain concepts in the application. He says, layer, image, to me as a beginning user, those aren't terms with a great deal of meaning yet. And then he goes on to say that he appreciated the visual previews for this reason. But if you kind of put yourself in the shoes of a user that doesn't understand all the domain terminology, things like layers and images, and you found a command that's called flip vertically, and you want to flip something vertically, it's like you've won. Then you click it, something totally unexpected happens, and you're like, what? No, that was it. Why doesn't it just flip the thing, right? So one, this kind of motivates the techniques. But also, it would be really interesting to see if you could use these techniques as a platform for teaching these domain concepts. So if you think about that moment where a really unexpected thing happens, that seems like a great time to say, hey, that's because you don't know the difference between layers and images. Let me tell you how this works. And so finally, several participants were concerned that they might continue to use the techniques long-term rather than learning the quote-unquote right way to do things. So one participant said, if there's a separate tool in the toolbox that does one of these, and I discover this first, then I'll probably just always end up doing this using the detour submenu when I just want the layer flip command. And so it's a bit hard to parse, but what he's saying is that he'd just keep using the detour submenu over and over and never actually find the normal place of the command in the interface. And we take the sense that for the novice or occasional user, this probably isn't so bad. The benefits of saved frustration are going to outweigh these small access inefficiencies. So I'm almost done, but there are a number of areas for future work. So first, as I've said, it would be really interesting to explore how these techniques could be used as a platform for teaching domain concepts. Second, because the visual previews were cited as an important feature of these techniques, there's this need for robust and efficient methods of generating previews for a wide variety of different commands. Third, it would be really interesting to develop a framework for migrating input between commands in sensible ways. I mean, there are some things that could work for some commands some of the time, but there's a lot of edge cases that would have to be addressed there. And finally, as I alluded to before, techniques for automatically identifying commonly confused commands could be developed. And this could be done on a global basis, commands that are always easy to confuse for one another, or on a particular user basis, modeling a user's existing knowledge and trying to figure out what that particular user might confuse in a given scenario. And with that, I'll end, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Hi, Joo-Ho Kim from Stanford and KAIST. Really nice work. I was wondering if you had enough data of real users using your system. I think it would be really interesting to think about ways to inform tool developers and those companies who are making these features and confusing names to actually update their software to avoid further confusion of the users. And would that mean I mean, in an ideal world, do you think your tool will sort of disappear in the perfect world where there would be zero confusion on the one side?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that I don't think that it would ever be able to disappear because everybody who comes into using a piece of software has these different conceptions and backgrounds that they come into it with. So for some examples, like the two flip vertically examples in GIMP that are both named just flip vertically, you could imagine flip image vertically and flip layer vertically, and maybe that would help. But I think that ultimately, there are always going to be some ambiguities that that occur. So the technique couldn't disappear entirely. Yeah.
Hey, great talk. Lydia, again, thanks. University of Washington, again. So I naturally grok the idea that giving video or image-based or previews is a perfect way to help people who don't know what's going on pick between commands. But you also gave a really good example of trying to tell the difference between an image and a layer, which I would say is primarily a conceptual difference rather than a visual one, which is why this exact thing might be hard. But yeah, but people need to be interrupted and get that conceptual difference. My question is whether you could leverage any of the data or the approach that you have here to find visual distinction that could help people learn that. Because for some case, there is maybe some visual distinction where it becomes clear the difference between the image and a layer.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the way I've kind of always thought about it is maybe you could come up with some succinct visual representation that, you know, you look at it and you say, oh, this is like I could imagine for layers, like some 3D stacking kind of metaphor or something like that. Other things that would be really hard, things like masks are a concept that people have trouble with in image editing software, and I don't know how you could quite communicate that one. But I think sort of on an individual concept basis, I think that these visual representations could be developed. I don't have any great insights as to how that could be done more than on a one-by-one kind of thing, I guess.
Okay, makes sense.
Any other questions? So a real quick one. It's kind of building on Juho's comment, thinking about restructuring how we actually look for these features in the first place. Instead of saying that maybe this will go away one day, have you thought about if it makes sense to start actually removing menus and say, okay, now just type in flip. You know you're looking for flip. Instead of trying to find it in one of n places, you type in flip and we tell you all the different ways that you might be able to flip something.
Yeah, I mean, I've done some previous work where I was looking at how you could have search in an interface for these sorts of things that you might want to do. I think that one of the advantages of these techniques is that they keep the interface stable on one level, and then they augment it with things to help users who are not up to speed on the concepts enough to use that stable interface. But that stable interface is still there. So, I mean, I think that I can't think of how it would be done, but it seems like a cool idea to integrate search into here somehow as well. But I'm not quite sure how it would be done just yet, but it would be cool.